Welcome to this Green Issues Forum. This is a series of programs produced by the Green Party of South Puget Sound. Today's offering will be a discussion on the possibility of public internet services provided by either the city or the port. And we have today with us several people who are very knowledgeable on the subject. First is Matt Booth, who knows a lot about recent legislation. Reed Ingalls is a member of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. They have a philosophic viewpoint on public provision of internet services. E.J. Zita is a port commissioner. It's one of the entities that might be providing internet services, possibly. Anders Schull, another member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And Chris Stern is a commissioner with the Thurston Public Utilities District. They would be involved in any public provision of internet services. So the first question we need to answer is, why are we even thinking about public provision of internet services? Does it provide some kind of advantage over private internet services such as Comcast or CenturyLink? We have Comcast and CenturyLink already. Why do we want public internet services?
I guess I will start off with this question. So we need to look at doing public broadband services for a variety of reasons. The first one is the private competitors have failed to reach the entire market. Comcast and CenturyLink, yeah, they might be okay within the city of Olympia, the city of Tumwater, city of Lacey, even down into some of our southern towns. But when you get out past the city limit, when you get out into the rural areas, their service is severely lacking. They do not provide adequate service to a very large percentage of our rural population. And that's true not just in Thurston County, but that's true across the state. It's been a significant problem for a very long time, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that later on.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that as well. Even in areas where the coverage is good, for the poor, people like myself, living with multiple roommates and low income students, all that sort of thing, they are providing service, but at exorbitant rates with no real options to choose between, and with relatively low speeds and I would consider fairly poor services. My own house experiences internet outages quite frequently, and we're still paying I think quite a bit more than we ought to, and don't really have any say in how we get access to this pretty vital knowledge resource for actually reproducing our daily lives.
Mm-hmm. So we have limited access in rural areas. We have limited access for people with lower incomes. Even for people who live in town that have the money, they can't always get good access. And in rural areas, even if you're close enough to the road, you might not be able to get that last mile connection. That's an issue. So we need more connections, we need fairer access, and we need more options. People need more options.
Now, politically, there's a group that really believes that the provision of internet services should be looked at mostly as an opportunity to earn some profits. And actually, for every opportunity to earn profits, it's better to let private entrepreneurs do it. And government should just stay out of the way. In fact, there's half of the states have already passed laws saying that public agencies like cities and counties are forbidden to have their own internet services. And it's because of this point of view. How would you answer them?
Part of the reason that the new legislation, which Matt can tell us a lot about, opens the opportunities up for ports to participate and help provide these opportunities is because one of the port's missions is to provide business and development opportunities. We also have a mission to be good environmental stewards and to help our communities. Providing more options for broadband helps businesses and helps development, and that helps local taxpayers. That helps us provide the services that our communities need, from infrastructure and roads to health and public safety. So if we can make it better for the business community, that can help everyone.
I would also add that from a socialist perspective, we're convinced that public internet, or the internet in general, is a type of utility that is very naturally provided as a public utility, similarly to water or sewage or electricity or garbage. These are things that everybody needs, that naturally is a monopoly, and that if a single company is providing it or a single institution is providing it, it should be answerable to the people who are using it, which is not the case when you have a private corporation providing that service.
So it's not really appropriate to think of it mostly as a business opportunity.
I mean, it's a great business opportunity if you can acquire that monopoly. It is something that naturally is a monopoly, and it's the sort of thing that municipalities have had a really great track record of providing to citizens for a long time.
And this is a viewpoint of people who, are ideologically committed to this idea of the free market provides everything, when it's demonstrated to not provide everything. There are some things that markets can provide well, but a lot of these things are not. To get really kind of like philosophical about it, Carl Polanyi said there's 4 false commodities that sort of define our society, things that are commodified, which I think really under ethical standards ought not to be: land, labor, money, and knowledge. And the internet today is the largest source of knowledge production. It operates as a commons, a shared resource that we all benefit from. And commodifying it restricts innovation, it restricts access, and restricts freedom. So decommodifying the internet is actually just something that should be done across the board everywhere in society, because it drastically improves everyone's access to knowledge and our quality of life.
And broader broadband access is good not just for big businesses, but for small businesses, for healthcare, for farmers. Farmers need internet to do their business too.
Mm-hmm. So does education, which has been a primary motive around the state to connect up all the schools, all the young people learning centers. Certainly the tribes in our county are already connected up, and their kids are already using the internet through grants that they've worked with the federal government. I just want to point out one thing to our audience, is that it's not just Comcast and CenturyLink. We also have Tenino Telephone operating in the South County, in Rainier and Tenino. And I believe, if not Pioneer, I think it's Fairpoint that's in Yelm. So there is competition, although they don't overlap each other. And there is lots of areas that are underserved. Scott Lake comes to my mind as a pretty urban density that doesn't get anything but dial-up. And you guys can't leave out the satellite producers, Dish and the others. They also provide internet, direct TV, all those, Hughes network. But they are mainly at dial-up speeds, so they're very dissatisfactory for many people.
Yeah, they're very slow and very expensive. Where my parents are from on the East Coast is a very rural area, and as of yesterday when I was talking to my dad, they still don't have good, reliable, high-speed internet. He was looking at doing HughesNet, which is a relatively well-known internet satellite company, and it was going to be pretty darn close to $150 a month.
So just to give an example of where the high speeds come from, NOAANET is a consortium that built the fiber trunk line of our state underneath the BPA wires, which are federally owned. Most people don't know that the BPA transmission lines are owned by the federal government in our county. And those trunk lines run throughout the state, to the east side of the state. There's a huge network that's been set up. And in those networks, high speeds are very well attained because they have a huge amount of capacity. And that's where the cloud is in Grant County for the internet. Most people don't know the cloud is situated in our state in eastern Washington. And also you
Don't
know,
tell
as
the
a
Russians.
well, maybe the Russians know, but you know, that we have a lot of infrastructure here, and already the cell phone towers, which allow your smartphones to operate with so much data, are already connected to the NOAA lines. Most of the public is unaware of this, that all the cell towers are now connected to NOAA lines. Private sector is paid to connect them up, but nonetheless, they are enjoying those speeds because of NOAA's lines, which is a publicly owned infrastructure inside
So we are
our state.
part way to public ownership
Yeah, in other
already.
words, the central highway of the internet is already publicly owned in this state.
Fantastic. So what would public ownership of internet imply for net neutrality? That's the big threat that we are told about every time we open up our inbox.
So we were talking about what does net neutrality mean and what would a loss of net neutrality mean. And I think a lot of people have the idea that net neutrality means that our access to content will be restricted. But my understanding is that it means that we may not have access to the speeds that we're used to, that certain users will have preferential access to faster speeds. Matt?
I think it's actually going to be slightly a combination of the two, mostly influenced by the speed issue that you were talking about there. Before we got on the air, Chris gave a really good kind of visual as to how to think about a lot of the speed issue with net neutrality. When you're on some major highways,
Going over Snoqualmie
yes,
Pass.
going over Snoqualmie Pass or going into downtown Seattle, where you see that some lanes are at 40, some lanes are at 35, some lanes maybe at 60 or 70. And that's kind of the gist of what a lot of the speed issue with net neutrality is. There'll be some people paying for the 70 or the 40. There'll be some people that aren't paying anything extra and are getting 35. And if you're only in the 35 lane, you're not necessarily going to be able to use a lot of the high bandwidth services, such as a lot of the video services like Netflix and Hulu, YouTube. A lot of the data transfer used in research or education, is
Or
going-
gaming.
or gaming. Gaming is a
Really
very
important.
thing to
Really
a lot of
important.
people.
For family tranquility.
But while in concept you would be able to get on these services on these low speeds, they would in effect be entirely useless because the bandwidth is not high enough to support the data that you're trying to access.
Add one other thing about that, that internet is naturally could be served as as a public utility, and one of the reasons why this is so attractive to these corporations is it's a way that they can differentiate their service from other people's service. I mean, naturally, the only differentiator in internet would be how fast it is and how reliable it is. That's pretty much all that there is. But if Comcast can say, look, Netflix works really well with us, it doesn't work well with other people, then that's one way they can make it a market where they're competing, but by artificially.
Yeah.
I understand you can also make your product come up in a search much sooner than your competition. If you put on a search for example, safe children's toys, what's going to come up is Toys R Us, rather than that nonprofit that has studied the subject and created a list.
I think that's an aspect of the internet before and now after the existence of net neutrality. That's a lot of paid ad services, and those are going to be essentially there no matter what protections we place on the internet. It's the monetization engine for Google. It's how they make their billions and billions of dollars, and that's not something we're trying to change right now. What we're trying to do is make it so that Comcast can't go to Netflix or one of the larger bandwidth content producers and shake them down for more money, saying that then because they paid extra money to have access to wider bandwidth, they can more reliably access their customers.
So the goal is to install more digital highways with more fast lanes so that people without a lot of money can get access.
Okay, so this is going to be easier with public ownership.
That's the goal.
Yes.
Yes, it will be easier with public ownership, but we also got to keep in mind that the state of Washington did secure net neutrality on a state level in law, and it's the exact same text that the Obama administration pushed through the FCC. So we already have it in statute in the state that we will be monitoring and protecting the neutrality of the internet, and that paid extra or paying more for more bandwidth is not okay in the state.
So that means we're not charging tolls on our highways, but is there enough room for everybody to travel? And that's where public entities can come in and provide more room for that information to travel.
Yeah, it's an area where it's actually more expensive for market-based solutions to provide that width. There's a reason we don't have private companies building roads.
Or private companies putting out fires.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are private companies that put out fires.
Right, but when they originally started that way, when the people who weren't paying the insurance burned down, they burned everybody else down too.
Right.
So they figured out that didn't work.
Yeah, this is what we're up against right now is pretty much when you think of the U.S. highway system in the late 40s and early 50s, where we're trying to build out that capacity so that it exists. And yes, it's a large public investment, but the return we're getting for that investment is going to be far greater than we can even imagine right now.
Especially if we work together and cooperate and do good advanced planning. If we do it bit by bit and without cooperative planning, we could end up with something we regret, like our car highway system.
Or like the current state of the U.S. energy
Well,
grid.
an example in the rural areas is just access to people far away, like in New Zealand, analyzing X-ray photos, for example, where they can't get access to it because it's a weekend or something, and they get somebody in New Zealand who's able to provide that service over the internet and get them a response immediately. That's where it's a value in handling emergency situations in hospitals in rural areas. And of course, it requires services beyond our borders, but nonetheless, and it's going to change our workforce, obviously, when you have people providing services across national lines. But
Yeah, and I think that also raises a point that increasingly, as a whole, we're moving towards a knowledge-based economy more and more. And so, if that's the direction things are going, people are doing more work with basically immaterial goods, information. It's really necessary that we actually build out in a way that supports that, and also supports not just volume of content produced and knowledge produced, but actually equitable outcomes, just outcomes for workers and for users of those services and products.
So we don't have complete freedom, though, to put up whatever internet services we want. Can you tell us something about the limitations?
Yeah, so in the state of Washington, public entities generally cannot provide the last mile of internet service. So they can, in several situations, they have the ability to bring fiber to within X number of feet of somebody's front door, but they cannot run it that last 500,000 feet into their house. Essentially, the limitation there is that there has to be a company in the middle of the public utility providing the service and the end user. And then up until this year, and actually it won't go in effect till June, but up until this year, only rural port districts and rural public utility districts defined by the state as an area with an average population density of less than 100 people per square mile were able to provide that trunk service or that everything but last mile service. So they could build, places like Grant County, Chelan County, Clallam County, Jefferson County, Grays Harbor County, Pacific County, all of those counties' PUDs were able to build out fiber networks into the communities, but then they had to contract onto a third party to bring the service into people's homes. And the cool thing about that is a lot of these third parties aren't your large companies like Comcast or CenturyLink. A lot of these are small mom and pop companies owned by people in the area that are not only providing a really good service to people, but they're also generating money for their local economy.
an example would be Toledo Telephone, which does a lot of trench work all around the state in putting in internet service lines, but is also a local operator in Southwest Washington.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and in our research group in DSA, on the topic of creating a people's internet. We even think that there's precedent for doing mom and pop outfits one better through the creation of cooperative, community-controlled internet provision services. There's a lot of examples, particularly using hybrid wireless approaches that are being developed in Europe. The largest in the world is a network called Wi-Fi, based in southern Spain, which provides, I believe, provides 30,000 network nodes. So, imagine like 5 times that amount of customers for free to people with a modest subsidy from the EU and a few other governmental agencies. And it does this by combining sort of public and private high-speed fiber lines with a modular and community-controlled wireless network that's built out voluntarily and managed democratically and cooperatively. So I think if we really put our thinking caps on, we can come up with some even better solutions that maybe no one's trying around here yet, but doesn't mean that we can't give it a whirl. I'm not the technical genius who's going to build the thing necessarily, but I know a few people who might be.
Grant PUD has produced some Wi-Fi free interchanges where Kitsap PUD is headquartered, which is in Paulsbo. They're providing free internet service there vis-a-vis Wi-Fi just locally for the town. They're able to do it through a property tax assessment that's countywide and much bigger than our own. We have one too, but not as big as theirs. And of course, they're the major water provider in their county too.
So rural ports or ports in rural counties have been able to provide dark fiber for over a decade now. And Port of Whitman County, I learned this from James Thompson at the Washington Public Ports Association, built a big fiber network over 300 miles long that serves WSU, Spokane, Pullman, Moscow. Now the ports can't do the internet service providing. They can't be the ISPs, and so they can be partners to bring that together. There are 17 internet service providers for that 300-mile network of optical fiber that the ports installed out there, that the Port of Whitman County installed out there. That used to only be allowed in rural counties. And the new legislation that was just passed this year allows ports in all counties to install that dark optical fiber and partner with groups to figure out, okay, how are we going to bring this into a live service? And so ports are meeting next month at our big spring meeting to take it the next step and take that planning and say, okay, how can we do this? How can we help provide this public service?
So you've described a kind of a business relationship with the public entity providing like the backbone and the arterials even, and the private entrepreneurs going the last mile. Are there any other types of business arrangements?
Well, one thing you should include in that is the theory behind that is that everybody has an equal chance to provide content and that they should be really competing over speed and content of the material they're providing rather than owning the infrastructure. And that's where, the differences ideologically exist between public and private, is that if everybody has the same ability, then it should be really an even playing field for the providers, and hopefully the public will get better service with competition.
Okay, so theoretically we're thinking that it would be better, and it has been tried here and there. How does that work out?
Well, I'd like to talk about 2 cities in Colorado real quick. First off, back in 2005, the state of Colorado actually banned municipal entry into the broadband market. They did have a little disclaimer in there, however, saying that if a city or a county decided to take a ballot initiative up and it was approved by the majority of the voters, then the city could go into it. The first city in Colorado to do this was the city of Longmont. They're a relatively small town, or not relatively small, they're actually about 150,000 people right outside the city of Fort Collins, kind of on the Front Range. And they brought their service online in 2011. And what they do is they provide end-to-end access for all their consumers, which means that they're not only the backbone, the dark fiber that ports are allowed to do, they're also the ISP. So when you pay your internet bill at the end of the month, you're paying it to the city of Longmont, Colorado. You're not paying it to Comcast or Wave or whichever broadband provider you're using. Couple cool things there. Just since 2011, they've been able to expand their reach to over 90,000 residents in the city of Longmont, after starting off with just a few thousand. And the cooler thing is all of these 90,000 residents have access to gigabit internet for $50 a month.
I take that.
I would take that too, considering I pay over $100 for 100 megabit internet from Comcast right now.
Especially if you knew where Longmont actually is,
Yeah,
which
it's-
is way out there. I mean, Fort Collins is where the state university is, but other than that,
Yeah, there's not a lot out there.
not a lot out there.
And then going back to Fort Collins, they actually recently they approved a ballot initiative back in 2015. And then as of a couple months ago, the city council has approved over $150 million in public debt to build out their infrastructure. And they see this, and I'm sure Zita will be able to elucidate on this further, they see this public debt as a strong investment in their community. And then if you look at what Longmont was able to do with their investment, not only have they been able to expand their network, but they're seeing companies choosing to move there. They just anecdotal reports from the city have dozens and dozens of internet startups coming to their city for fast, reliable, and cheap internet. If we were able to do something like that in the city of Olympia, where we can cut prices to, maybe 50% of what they are today, I'm sure that we would have a relative boom of startups in the city of Olympia.
And reliability is
And-
huge.
Yes.
Especially with all these trees.
Hopefully we figure out the housing issues before they all show up. Eh?
Absolutely.
That might be a motivator. Maybe we
Yeah.
can do these things together.
Yeah, deadline before Amazon shows up and takes over. We gotta get the housing prices under control.
Has
I'm
a
moving.
community ever tried to provide internet services for everyone and just pay for it through taxes?
Not to my knowledge. I'm not sure if you folks know anything about that. I don't know
I just
anything
gave
on
you some short examples, but it's not the whole, all of the citizens. I think one of the things that Kitsap PUD has been very successful in doing is doing everything but providing service, right to the door. They have invested in LUDs, which is setting up people for fiber and then letting the private sector compete for the final connect up. And they've had a high demand because Kitsap County is a very direct suburb of Seattle with a lot of people commuting between the two places. And so there's a very high need for that service, and many people operate businesses out of their homes these days, as do in our county. And that's why there's been a strong interest. I get the most inquiries of any utility, even more than electricity, which was a fight we had 6 years ago, where on internet service, and people are still hungry for that kind of speeds and access to services.
Yeah, and
Competition.
I always hear fiber mentioned as the technology that we're going to use. Why is that?
So it's glass, it's smooth glass, fibers, and
Speed of
the
light.
light goes through
Fiberglass,
it. And it
yes.
just bounces off the edges inside, and it carries a signal smooth and clean and fast.
Yeah, once you
And
have
it doesn't heat up. It
Once
doesn't
it's
heat up like
extremely
copper
cheap.
does.
Yeah, once you have it in place, you're basically looking at zero marginal cost of production. So it's just practically infinitely reproducible as information itself. Once the investment's in there.
Okay.
And also, the technology keeps moving. They're now working on microfibers and things that are much smaller, so they can make it even more compact. When you watch and see the cable provided to your neighborhood, you'll see the overlap where it seems like it's run over itself. That's so it can expand out to future users. So they think about that before they even put it up. Who is potentially going to need it, and
for
provide enough
communities-
fiber for it.
If a community's smart, I learned this from Reese Roth at the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure at Evergreen. Whenever you have to dig up the street to fix a water pipe or anything, you want to install fiber then. You want to install whatever utilities you need to, at least the potential for them. Even if you're not sure you're going to have a market for it yet, even if you don't know who the internet service provider is going to be and what it's going to hook up to, when you've got the street dug up, put it in, get all the fiber laid, and someday you're going to need it.
And that has a
At least the
moniker.
conduit.
That has a moniker. It's called dark fiber, which means it's not lit up. That's why it's dark. And the cities in our county own a great deal of it and are negotiating, with the private sector about the use of it because it's a facility that can be used. And like Zita said, it's cheap to install when you're already digging up the street for your water or sewer. And they do. And if they're not putting in dark fiber, like not the fiber itself, they're putting in conduit where they can run the fiber later in it. So one way or another, conduit's just, a pipe where you can run the fiber later. So one way or another, they're trying to place the infrastructure so it's present. And of course, the densest populated areas are the ones that are going to be the most profitable to any company.
Yeah.
Anders, you wanted to say something.
I think that,
And
Chris just got it.
that's not to say that fiber optics is the only technology available. There are several different types of technology for delivering internet. All of them have their own pros and cons. I know the city of Tacoma tried SparkNet a while ago, which was where they would transmit internet service over power lines. And that has some advantages. For instance, the line's already there. However, it's not as fast. I forget what it tops out at, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 megabits per second.
And they already own the electric lines.
Yes.
Well, and in rural areas where you have line of sight, you can use microwave and point-to-point
And-
to make those connections.
Yep, and I was also going to talk about technology coming online now, which has some pros and some cons. It's 5G networks, it's the next generation in wireless, which does offer significantly higher speeds than 4G. Just gets into something Chris was talking about earlier, the pole attachments issue.
Which has been fought mainly with the public utilities.
Yes.
The privates have a separate agreement.
Yes, but these boxes can only transmit 500 or 600 feet at a time. So you need more of them, you need them closer together, and generally, if you're not daisy chaining them together, which is you're transmitting information from box to box to box to box, it needs a fiber hookup. So it would need to go into a backbone.
And if you've watched electric utilities and how they place things on poles, electricity is always on the top, and there's a reason for that. They don't want people maintaining anything above their electric lines and damaging the lines
Or getting
or
hurt.
getting hurt. And 5G requires to go over the lines, hence the conflict, plus who subsidizes it. The public doesn't believe in giving away anything for free. In fact, I'm mandated by law not to.
Reed, will you remind us how the GWI works?
Yeah. That does kind of go back to the original point, because the mesh networks, which is Wi-Fi and these other ones, including ones existing in the U.S., are sort of in the family of basically linked Wi-Fi routers with various extension antennas that are connecting together to share an internet connection, essentially, which can be in the realm of like 10 people to 100,000 people with enough infrastructure behind it. Are able to essentially provide the service for free, mostly because they rely often on nonprofit funding and volunteer labor. So a lot of times they're started as initiatives of just 4 or 5 people who are interested in programming or see an unmet need in their community. A good example is in Detroit. There's I believe it's called like the Internet Justice Project or something along those lines, where huge areas of Detroit basically had no internet access. ISPs wouldn't touch it. So they wrote some grants, got a little bit of funding to buy some tech, and started building out a mesh network, which they were able to convince an ISP to support with a backbone. And so really one of the things that we're looking at is how to put this technology more and more in the hands of the community as a whole, and how government and the resources in government can help support people-led initiatives to actually control these resources and truly compete to drive down the cost to the point where maybe some people aren't paying anything, or they're paying in a bit of volunteer labor or a little bit of time off their device to help maintain the system as a whole. But it's not taking something out of their paycheck necessarily.
Well, that sounds great, and it makes me curious exactly how much infrastructure are we talking about?
And what kind?
Yes, I've heard electricity poles and conduits where you can install dark
Underground.
fiber.
Underground.
Yes, conduits. And some of it is projected to be aerially put in, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally an approach that utilizes everything that we've got is probably the best thing, like to finding ways that these different systems harmonize and can support each other. So for example, the ones I'm talking about, the basic technology is a simple Wi-Fi router. All you have to do is install the correct firmware so it can run a program that allows it to connect up with other Wi-Fi routers, and then supporting it with fiber, supporting it with traditional internet hookups. And I think we're not limited to that either. It's entirely possible that as the community in Thurston County and around here looks into this issue more, we might come up with something completely new and even better.
I have one question. What other business models are entering the marketplace? I mean, we've heard of Google getting interested in distribution and ISP work. Has there been any changes in that?
Not necessarily. As far as I know, Google...
Different business models to provide services.
Not that I know of. As far as, and actually I was reading something today about how Google was pushed out of the market in Kansas City, where they had built a very reliable, very fast public broadband network that they gave away for free. In Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas? I forget which Kansas City it was.
The bigger ones in Missouri.
Yes, probably Missouri then. But they were pushed out by some rulemaking changes at both the FCC and within the state legislature. And then when the city of Chattanooga in Tennessee was looking to expand into their neighboring counties, they were actually banned from doing that by the court system. For a variety of reasons. Essentially, it was the FCC gave them the okay in 2015, right about the time the net neutrality regulations that were pretty all right came out, but the court struck it down a year later. Yeah. Other than that, I really don't know of a lot of new technologies coming online to distribute beyond 5G, which is what's really being pushed by the major carriers in the world.
Yeah. And I think like the example you gave in Chattanooga, these places where it's been banned preemptively, maybe points to the fact that there may be possible alternative arrangements, different models, but the emerging internet monopolies would really like to not see those
they
come about.
They lobby their butts off.
Well, we've seen this with electricity 100 years ago, where today in the United States, 15% is publicly owned between co-ops, which are nonprofit for private entities, and municipals and PUDs, which are utility districts that operate mostly in their own counties. And only, I think, 4 states have PUDs, including Nebraska and the West Coast. So it's fairly limited. The power of lobbying shows itself here, because the public entities cannot lobby like private sector can. And so they usually get their bills passed or at least halfway done.
We see the market quashing competition in this case.
And I do want to go back to the infrastructure bit real quick, because that is going to be the most pricey part of this, especially when it comes to cities, ports, building it out. The price tag on the front, yes, may be a little eye-popping. But when you were talking earlier about parts in Detroit that aren't served, when we were talking earlier about rural areas that aren't served, that's where that profit motive becomes an issue. Because these large companies like Comcast, actually pretty much any company that's publicly traded has something known as a fiduciary duty, where they have to make a certain amount they have to make money and give it back to their shareholders.
A return.
A return. And a lot of the time, they're looking at very narrow windows of return. Sometimes quarters, sometimes 3-4 years, very rarely over 5. And what Zita has told me, and several other people, and what a lot of people have told me is that when it comes to the public agencies, they're not looking at such a small window of return. They're looking at more 10, 15 years of return. So like in areas of Detroit, a cable company wouldn't go to an area because they didn't think they'd have enough subscribers to where they would turn a profit on their installation in 5 years. If the city of Detroit looks at it and is like, okay, there's a lot of people. There's actually a lot of people here. We don't think we can make it back in 5 years, but we can make it back in 8 or 9 years. Then the city has the ability to do that because they're not tied to such a heavy fiduciary responsibility.
And to some, oh, go
I
ahead.
was going to add one thing to that, which is, yes, it's a huge upfront investment or a very large one, but you can pretty much immediately cover your operating expenses. Like, there's no issue there with covering your operating expenses and beginning to pay down that debt.
Oh, I'm
And
well
that's-
aware of that.
And
Yeah,
you,
well,
and
yeah,
you can
that's something
contract
to-
your operating expenses, especially maintenance of the system, to
Yep.
people like Toledo Telephone.
I'm glad that you brought up fiduciary responsibility, because the notion of fiduciary responsibility has a much broader meaning to us at the port than it does to Comcast. It's not just making money. We spend public money and then make it back. We also provide services. We provide services for the public. We try and provide resources that are going to help the community economically. And we have a fiduciary responsibility to meet the needs that the community helps identify, including environmental stewardship. So one of the advantages and disadvantages of ports is that we have the ability to borrow money based on our ability to tax. And sometimes we do it too much. But if we do it for the right thing, it can be good for the community.
Yeah, and I think expanding the notion of investment and responsibility is really important when we're talking about these issues. Like going back to this concept I brought up of the knowledge commons. Like take this project in Detroit, for example. Not only are they just providing internet service to people who would be denied it otherwise, they're also providing, since it's community-based, community-controlled, and people are actively taking a part in the development of the network. You're also like taking underserved youth from that same community, people who wouldn't ordinarily get the responsibility or the opportunity to even touch a computer, let alone get on there and start learning programming, to actually participate in this development. And so it's a whole aspect of this investment that that's not normally getting measured, but you're actually really developing human potential and doing it in a sustainable, responsible way for people who are especially marginalized and left out of the system: youth, people of color, women, in a city like Detroit. And we have those same issues here, less or so, but I think when we're talking about developing this infrastructure, we really got to be thinking about not just the bottom line, but the social bottom line of like what sort of network do we want to build, what sort of knowledge economy, what sort of common pool resource are we trying to create for people that not only allows them to play video games high speed, but actively reaches out and engages people in the process of development.
And we actually do have some facts and figures, which are estimates of what it would take to build out a system in various parts of the county. The Mottman area, Mottman industrial area.
The old brewery site.
Yes.
And Hawks Prairie and Lacey was what Lacey asked for.
Can you give us some of those figures?
These were done about 2 or 3 years ago, so they're a little dated to today. But we did a study with NOAANET as the principal entity providing the cost of putting in the infrastructure, and came up with the smallest project was the brewery district, and that was a fairly high cost per customer, $5,500 in equipment and connection. Total construction was $385, so it would be a pretty large return on investment. Be 18 years. We were looking for a lower return on investment of 8 years.
Excuse
and
me.
Then, and 7
total
years.
construction 385 what?
1,000 for that, because there's nothing there right now. Pretty much just brewery is. I think Lott's putting in a facility in there, but that's all that's committed to that area right now. Tumwater's been working actively to do more, and I'm sure they will, but as of the study, there wasn't anything there.
There's a big new brewing and distilling center going on right up the hill now.
Okay, so
One
more,
of them
more is
costs
taking
about
place.
$2 million, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this was done a few years ago, as I said, it's outdated, but we did include a residential neighborhood in Olympia, which was the Madison neighborhood, and that was roughly $1,500 per customer for connection, including equipment, and monthly operation was about $7,100, monthly administration $4,000. So the return on investment for that was about 11 years. And the cities balked at the time. All three cities balked at doing anything. We didn't provide the opportunity to the poor, which I
We didn't
regret.
have the option. We didn't have the
Right.
option.
So, but thinking ahead. But
So about
but,
how many people would that Mottman project cover?
that covered from 4th Avenue over to about 10th,
Okay.
and between East Side and up near Lions Park.
And do you know the number of customers that would be, or?
It's just a normal suburban neighborhood, or actually urban neighborhood, fairly close, single-family homes. So, yeah, I can't tell you exactly how many people were involved. But that was the only residential neighborhood. All the others were business areas except for apartment buildings, like downtown Olympia and to the, potentially to the port. So,
We have a lot of business customers down there.
yeah,
So even though
And
we're
the farmer's market.
farmers market.
even though we keep talking about the advantages, the future advantages to people having this internet connection and how it's going to help with education and medicine and so forth, what this assessment actually comes down to is would it pay, right?
Right, and of course in the densest areas, you get the most connections, so that's why
And
the biggest
so would it
companies
And
are
even
really
in the
there.
densest areas, it's a little bit problematic because the dense areas are already hooked up with either Comcast or CenturyLink. And so you would be the third provider there. And I think they said that they were expecting to get about a third of the people in the area signing up.
As Reed has said, though, would it pay in what sense? Would it pay just in the sense of how much is it going to cost per household to get internet? What are the other services that are provided? And there's a bigger picture. We've been talking off and on about connections between information technology and energy. And we're on the cusp of the third industrial revolution, when new energy technologies connect with new ways of getting information out. That's when you have a revolution. It happened with coal and trains, and it's happening now with renewable energy and the internet. And so by providing a bigger and more connected internet everywhere in Washington State, that gives us potentially the ability to have better management of distributed, renewable energy that we're producing. We're already producing hydro. We're building out more solar, more wind, making it a cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous state. Better jobs.
So one example of this is everybody hears about the Internet of Things, how your appliances are even listening to you as those people who are suspicious. Believe me, I have reason to be suspicious. But nonetheless, you can now run them more efficiently or at different times when there's not so much energy being consumed. That evens out your load. And as far as an electric producer, you don't want all those peaks where you're paying high costs to produce that power when everybody else wants it. You're trying to drop that load at that time and even it out. And these appliances are now operating in the lull times, which makes the whole system more efficient and less prone to outages.
So that's for drawing energy from the system. We're also increasingly having distributed energy production into the system. We are putting solar on our farms, we're putting solar on our schools, we're putting wind on the hills and probably offshore in the next couple of decades. And so how are we going to manage those flows of energy? How are we going to get the energy where it needs to be, when it needs to be? And we need a good internet system for this.
And just to jump in too, yeah, I think that's really important because we're not just talking about we're talking about reducing people's bills and providing better service, but we're also, we need to be thinking ahead to
The future.
the industrial revolutions of the future, which are happening right now. And to kind of put on my socialist cap here, literally Karl Marx wrote about this back in his work researching the Industrial Revolution in England. It's a small couple of paragraphs he wrote in the Grundrisse, one of his books, called The Fragment on Machines, is what it's known as by Marxist scholars, where he's basically describing this tendency he was seeing in factories and production at the time, where the more information is imbued in a good, in a machine, it consistently drives down the cost of production and reproduction from that good. So he's seeing like people moving from hand tools to industrial machines. These are things with information literally built into them, instructions on how to operate. And now we're getting to this point of extreme density of information within our goods, and we're seeing
Alexa, oh my God.
Yeah, we're seeing things where they can essentially, information goods, files, basically on our computer can be reproduced infinitely for free. And the more that quality is imbued into physical goods, the more efficiency it puts into the system. So when we're talking about like energy, imbuing more information content is really important, but to do that we need the infrastructure to actually supply the information and the communication between physical objects and information that's stored on them.
So that's sort of like knowledge density.
Yeah.
In
There's
the products we
the
produce.
book, really interesting book on this subject by British journalist Paul Mason called Post-Capitalism, which I'd recommend checking out if you want to kind of understand the Marxist side of that. But obviously most Marxist stuff is also supported by classical economics like Adam Smith, because that's what he's drawing on.
Did we even talk about Baton Rouge?
We never got to Baton Rouge.
Baton Rouge
We've
is
been
another-
talking about it
another-
since we got here.
Oh,
so-
well, you
Another capital.
better
Enlighten us,
tell us
please.
about Baton Rouge.
Baton Rouge is another publicly owned system that is operating like Chattanooga. It's probably constrained as well as Chattanooga was, but is doing just fine and profitable. And the PUDs have all operated with their fiber systems on different business models, and some are more profitable than others. It's still a long-term experiment.
And jumping back to Chattanooga 1 second, like even though they have all the problems that they're having expanding, when they started in, I believe, was it 2010 or something like that, it's not that long ago, they provided 1 gigabit service, which was fantastic. And they've upgraded their system since then, providing 10 gigabit service to a lot of customers.
Wow.
And that's something that private corporations just don't do. They don't expand their...
There's no incentive.
Yeah, there's no incentive. And so, yeah, I mean, Chattanooga is in a lot of ways not a success story, but it also shows what a success story it could be if there weren't these constraints.
Wow.
Well, I think we've determined that we'd like to try this, either from the port or from the city. Or
People are hungry for this.
yes,
Yes.
yes, they're hungry for faster speeds and
Better
Well,
access.
yes.
Yeah.
Some areas are definitely underserved.
And people have visions about what we could do if this was in place.
So how are we going to get there? What needs to be done? Do we have to have different laws, or can we do it with the existing laws?
We've got this good new law that expands the port's ability to be a partner, so ports and public utility districts can work together. We can work with municipalities. We can work with businesses. We still can't be the internet service provider, but that we're not stuck with just Comcast and CenturyLink.
Oh, yes, and one of the models that we heard about was expanding internet services in tandem with expanding the electrical services, so that the smart net can expand at the same time as the internet.
Certainly the most successful public utilities have been the ones that are already in electricity, because they hooked up all their substations already and then threw radios out into the community from
Right.
there, and they own their own poles, so they don't have to deal with all that. But I will just say one thing, a lot of funding went out 9 years ago, with the beginning of the Obama administration, there were strings attached to that, and they're still suffering from some of those strings, but they did get some grant funding to put out infrastructure. The PUDs did. One of the things that I can say is that everybody's trying to work with models that'll work. Sometimes they've been reliant on other parts of their utility producing electricity, like in central Washington, or being an electric utility countywide, which earns them far greater income, and they're able to subsidize other services. We're not in that position. We're a water utility, and water is very expensive to produce and
We would be in a
regulate.
much better position if we'd passed that initiative that we ran with in 2014 to have our own electric services.
Well, I definitely get the point that the public wants more services.
Yes.
They keep talking about internet, and I see that as something that's very important to people's livelihoods, to their education for their children, and of course to the health system, fire, emergency, everything. So I see that as a very interconnected service that's important to everybody.
I think
Yeah.
one of the questions now is, how do we do the planning together? The port can help with the planning process. We're not experts in utilities. PUDs know a lot about utilities. So we have to figure out how to do these planning processes together, how to take the next steps. What ports are really good at is funding projects like this. And if
I'm ready
we
to
are
do
to fund projects like this, those planning processes and the decisions we make should be done in collaboration with the public. We're not going to just say, oh yeah, we like this idea, throw some money at it. It has to be part of a public planning process.
And anytime you're talking about a capital infrastructure, sure, we're a taxing district just like the port is. If you're asking to raise taxes more than 1%, that has to go immediately to the public for a vote. And in the past, the public's not been so great about granting tax increases. But if you can justify something with a well-proposed program, you may get enough people to support it. It would take a large campaign.
And we only have about 30 seconds to go, but what are the DSAs going to do to help out?
Yeah, I was just going to say, while these fine folks in government are working out the red tape, which I absolutely don't want to deal with, we're just going to go ahead and build the thing. We're not the whole thing. We're building a small part, but we're currently working with the public, working with the people of Thurston County by reaching out, doing surveys and interest, trying to get them engaged while we're getting people who are good at tech, good at programming, and we're just building out proofs of concept. I was just at a meeting where we were doing one of our first tests on some Wi-Fi routers, so we're going to be going around and trying to experiment with this technology and roll some of it out and see if we can't provide some actual experimental results that once the red tape is worked out, we can really get together and go.
You talked to Lisa Smith from Enterprise for Equity. She helps business startups. They're a good resource, and she often talks with bankers, the things that you need when you need to borrow money. And believe me, I have to go out for bonds, as do you. So you have to convince your bankers that you're creditworthy and you're going to raise enough revenue to cover it.
We are definitely out of time, and we've had a tremendous amount of information here presented to the public. I want to thank all of you for your participation, and also thank the audience for listening. We'll be back in another couple months.